glad you made it back for one more video. Let's get started with the list of items that are needed. 2 ice blue LEDs, 1 white LED, an expansion board, 1 power lead, and of course some UV resin. And just a word of caution, and I do have to advise you, it is extremely difficult to put it back together. With that out of the way, let's get started with the process. It's really a long video, so if you're only painting, you can skip to the painting part. If you're not adding lights, just go right there. But if you are, you're gonna have to heat it up in some hot water for 20 minutes. Don't put it on the stove. Just microwave some water or boil some water, put it into a tub, and fill it halfway so you can soak it all the way up to the shoulder joints. That lens will pop out with a small screwdriver because it's going to be soft plastic. This is the chassis on the inside. This framework holds the entire mold together, and those stumps that you saw there is where the glue is already adhered, so it's going to have to be softened up. This is the ball joint that is incredibly difficult not only to pull apart but to put back together. And of course you got the ball joints on the arms. This is the entire piece as you see it here. It is obviously a gray plastic. You really don't have to primer it if you don't want to, because this plastic takes paint really well, especially the Vallejo paint, and that's what I'm going to be using as a base coat. So I'm not even going to use Mr. Super Clear. This is the cavity on the inside, and as you can see, is incredibly roomy to put in all kinds of electronics. Now those gaps that you saw on the inside, those squares, that's where it's glued. There is glue on the edges at the bottom, but that comes up really easy. What's most difficult are those areas that are right underneath the shoulder joints. So you're going to use your vise drill with a 1/8 bit to drill out some holes. And the first hole that we are going to drill is going to be the arc reactor so that we can place an ice blue LED. We're only going to use 2, one for the arc reactor and one for the helmet. So very soft plastic, so be very careful. And that's why you want to use a vise drill, because if you use a Dremel, you may burn your plastic or just cut away too much of it. Make sure the perforation is nice and clean so that the lead you feed through there does not snag. Now, we are going to make sure that we pass it through there, and we're going to tape it down on the inside. We don't need to glue it, only on the outside where we are going to be reattaching that lens. And again, that lens can reattach by heating up that plastic, and very carefully, without marring the surface or the edges, we can replace that lens back in there. Now see that hole on the inside? We don't have to glue that in there. We can just use a piece of tape to hold it against the wall of that cavity. So installing that blue LED is just as easy as you've seen in the other videos that I've shown you. Feed it through that perforation, bend it at an angle so it is a right angle, and then very light UV resin on the edges. It doesn't take a whole lot. Then push it back into place. Use the UV light to cure that very thin layer of UV resin. It doesn't take very long to do so because it's very thin. And then add another layer of UV resin on top of that, right on top of the LED, almost creating its own lens. And because it's clear, it's not going to be visible. It is going to hold it in place. Well, we can say it's going to be permanent. You don't have to do it on the inside because you're not going to be able to get the light in there, and you've already got the tape holding it down. Once you've got this done, make sure your hands are clean so that you can touch that lens, or if you can use a pair of gloves, then you can reattach that lens in there. You just don't want to have fingerprints all over it. On the outside, you can clean off the fingerprints. On the inside, yeah, you want to make sure it's clean before you do that. very carefully with a flathead screwdriver, mold it back into its position. And of course, you saw what your project should look like now. If you tested out your arc reactor, it should light up a nice ice blue. Now this is the inside of the helmet. It's a white plastic. It is soft plastic. It is not translucent, however. So you are going to have to cut out a cavity behind the eyes as best you can. Now once you've thinned it out enough, you're going to place it back into the helmet and trace out the eyes and cut out just the area for the eyes. We're going to be filling in that slot with, well, for one, with putty, wait for it to harden, and then fill it with resin, just enough to make a cap. Then we're going to place the LED on the inside because we only have one, and that one LED will light up both eyes. So we're going to place it in the center where it's not going to be visible from the exterior looking at the helmet. It will transfer the light to both of the eyes because of the UV resin we're going to fill it with. And just like the optic, fiber optics that transmit light through a translucent material, well, this is the same basic concept. So we're using one single light to transmit light to both eye sockets. Now, if you've got a vise like this or some other hardware that can help you hold that skull while you're putting the LED in there, definitely use it. Now, the LED takes just a little bit of resin on the back of it to set into place. Set it between the eyes, the area that's going to be hidden by the mask when you look at it from the exterior. Once you've set it in place, you are going to fill in that cavity so that you can create thin layers of resin and build it up to fill it up. And once you fill that, you will be creating two lenses for those eye sockets. Now, it may spill over and cause a mess on the exterior if you didn't actually tape it or use a silicone to create a cap. Don't worry, you're gonna have to pull it and you're gonna have to sand it down. And you want to sand it down because you want those eyes to be not opaque, but you want them to be a white, like a frosted white. And then if you really want to, you can take a glaze or a Tamiya X22 and create a high gloss on that resin. But in any case, once you've got it glued in, you've got it filled in, you can cap off any light fall off with some epoxy sculpt. Now, as you do your sanding, you'll find some imperfections in the eyes that are caused by the resin, maybe some bubbles, etc. Fill those in and then sand it down again, polish it out. And again, if you want to have those lenses high gloss, then use a Tamiya X22. Do not use resin over that and expect it to be glossy, because it will become dull and matte, especially when you handle it with the oils in your finger. It will become dull and you're not going to like the look. I used Tamiya X22 to be able to have a high gloss acrylic look. Once you put it back in the helmet, it looks awesome. One light will handle both of those eye sockets. Now that inner body frame is where you're going to attach the expansion board and hook up your wires. It's actually very thick plastic, but it's still soft, so a vise drill is all you need to drill into it. I did add another board and it ended up not working the way I wanted, but I left the video in case you want to go ahead and add a different board. And that board was a flicker board to make the eyes flicker and the actual spotlight that's on the arm. Nevertheless, this frame is what holds everything together inside. Those square stumps that you see on left and right side, that's where it's glued. And that's where you have to submerge it into a half tub of water so that the hot water can soften the glue on those specific areas. Everything else, no glue. It just goes in by pressure. So when I put it back together, no more glue. I do not want to glue it back down. It doesn't need it. Just the amount of pressure that's in there is enough to hold it together tightly. Now, as you can see, all the wires fit on one side, and it's enough to light up just those three portions. You can't wire the hands because the way they set the pegs into the hand, it doesn't allow you to run a wire through there. And if you do, then you can't switch hands. So I just preferred only to light up the light that's on the arm and the eyes and the chest. As you can tell, at the base of the peg, just at the back side of the head, there's a small hole. That is going to be to lead the wire into the chest cavity coming from that helmet. And it's not going to be visible. You do not want to glue it down in there, only into the head, because you want to have that slack to be able to turn left, up and down to reposition the head any way you want. So if all you want to do with this figure is paint it, you don't have to take it apart. You can skip the other half of this, the first 14 minutes, and go straight to painting. No airbrush needed, lots of dry brushing, so get your favorite 3 brushes and that's all you need. I ended up using Vallejo paint gunmetal base coat. It turned out really, really awesome. Now for video purposes, I've already done one of the legs here, as you can tell, one with, one without, and the silver on the right side is the one I am going to show you in this part of the segment. So once again, Vallejo paint gunmetal base coat. It works out really well. It goes on very thin, very smoothly, no runs, no messes. It's awesome. Just make sure that it is fully dry before you go in and add a different tone on top of that. As you can tell, the one I've already worked on has kind of a brownish or copper tone to it, and that's because I added a wash over those. I took a craft paint and I used it as a wash over that gunmetal because I don't want it to look exactly like, well, just like a rusted gunmetal. Matter of fact, I have the Hot Toys version of this, and it has copper and other tones in there, not just black and gray and silver. It actually has some earth tones in there, making it look that much richer. So it's all going to depend on your liking how much of a wash you want on there. I do have to advise you that the craft paints are not necessarily the best. So only use them sparingly. As a wash, they work great because you're just going in very, very thin layers. And it's just enough to stain the surface of the other paint, in this case, the gunmetal gray. And just gives it a different and richer metallic tone. Now, once you've done this, you're going to repeat the same process for the arms, for the torso, and of course for the hands. Don't forget the hands. And of course, the helmet. Don't have the craft paints or you don't like using craft paints, don't use them. use whatever paint you've got. Just mix those tones so that you can create your own version of the actual character. Or if you want to be more accurate to the movie, then of course follow the references that you have. Just make sure that before you go on to any of the other limbs, other parts of the actual body, that you seal your work and you make sure that that sealant, that paint is fully dry before you add any other paint or any other coats of different washes, because it is still soft. Even though it appears dry, it is still probably going to be sticky to your hands. You're going to have to give it at least 8 hours to fully cure, fully dry, so you can actually manipulate it with your hands. And just as a word of caution, I did let it dry, and as I put it back together, because it was so difficult, I did end up rubbing paint off certain areas. So I had to do some touch-up work on my work, which was frustrating because I had to match what I had. So take your time and make sure that it is fully dry before you handle the figure once more. So after adding my paint to the gunmetal, I then added a black wash using a black Liquitex paint. I diluted it to make it a very thin, well, it's a black wash, so it's actually very translucent, and it's just enough so that it dries quickly. I ended up using a sponge to give it a texture for a metallic finish. I just didn't want brush strokes to be present when I had it dry. So it all depends on what you want it to look like. If you want to go thicker into those crevices with the black, then go with a finer brush, or just use the stippling effect either with a brush or with the sponge. I prefer the sponge in this situation because it covers more area and it leaves a better texture, as if it were kind of a pebble surface on the metal. It looks actually really, really good once you have it in front of you. It's a little bit more difficult to capture it in camera. Once you've completed this, let it dry, and then go on to the torso and the arms and just repeat the same steps. I'll let you watch these next few segments and I'll get back to you in just a moment. you can see in the video, I have covered up the lens. I obviously don't want to paint over that. I don't want any glazes, any paint, nothing. I want to keep it clean. Now, if you take a look at this next part of the segment, I am not painting the arm sockets. I am keeping them clean of any paint because I don't want these pieces to end up sticking and then stripping out paint. I'm only painting around it. Because it's a gray, it's really going to be difficult to tell if it's painted or not. And it's a robot, so it's going to be it's a gunmetal gray in plastic. But as you can see, the different tones that are actually now picking up on that gunmetal with the washes that I did to it, it looks so much better. Now once the black paint is dry here, I'm going to go back in there and add the highlights to those hoses that are under the area of the arm and into the back. So I'll let you watch the rest of the segment and I'll get back to you in just a moment. Great, you've made it this far. Now we can add some weathering, and that's nothing more than just taking a straight silver and stippling with the brush on the edges. If you want to go a little deeper by actually burnishing them in there by feathering it in, even better. It just has a whole different look, a whole different effect. And at this point you can add it to any of the surfaces that are raised, causing a look of wear and tear. It's going to be totally unique in your own. So if you want to go with different tones, different colors other than this, then by all means, you're the one that's going to be having it on the shelf. You're the one that's going to be looking at it. So take your time and make sure that you use the technique that you want. I am using a dry brush technique simply because it works really well with all the texture that is on here. And I've already done this to the surface here. You can tell where I have the different tones of gray as if the metal was worn. It looks really, really good. So I ended up doing the same to the legs. And this depends how much wear and tear you want to have actually shown in the figure. Now, as the paint dries, some of the effects may be diminished because of the drying, so you may have to go back in and do some more touch-up work. Every paint is different. There's no perfect paint. You just have to learn to work with the characteristics of the paint you have purchased. So you're going to repeat the same for the arms and the hands. And the two loose hands you're going to have to hold with a different device so you don't get paint all over your hands. As you paint one item or one limb, the other will be drying, and it will allow you then to go back and add those washes. So just remember that before we do any work, which is coming up in the next segment, we have to drill a hole for some lights. We want to make sure that the paint is fully dry. We don't want any of our work coming off because we have scratched it, etc. So you're gonna allow for at least 8 hours of dry time. I went 24 just because I have one or two projects going at any one time. Well, one dries or glue dries, then I'm working on another one, and that gives me enough time to get back to it later. So once it's fully dry, we're going to take our vise drill one more time, our 1/8 bit, and we're going to drill straight into that plastic lens and take it all the way to the other side. And we want to make sure it's a clean perforation because we don't want that lead to get stuck in there, and then we have to end up pushing it through. So the cleaner we drill it out, the better and easier it is to install it. You are going to have to countersink that LED so you can create a lens using the UV resin. Or if you've got a different material, then you can use that to create a lens. But as you can see, I've already bored through there. It's going to be that much easier to then put that lead in there. Now, we are also going to have to drill into the actual arm because we want that lead to go through the ball socket. So we're going to remove the actual ball joint by heating it up and then drilling into that area. So feed the LED into the cavity you have just perforated. Very carefully pull it through there, and you're going to angle it at a 90 degree and then set it inside as best you can. Use a smaller tool, not just your hands, to push it as deep as it will allow you to push it in there, simply because you don't want it to be on the surface and then end up getting damaged. So you may have to remove it and then countersink it if you did not do so. For video purposes, I've already drilled out the arm, and I'll just show you what angle I used. It's more like a 30-degree angle into the socket itself, and then with a knife, cut a notch for the wire to rest against so you don't pinch it when you reattach that ball joint. So when you reattach the ball joint, make sure that it does not pinch that wire. Make sure you have enough slack so you can bend it at the elbow and you can actually position the arm. So be very careful because it is a thin wire and it will break. So it's now time to reattach the arm onto the body cavity. So I've drilled out just underneath the arm joint or socket. Now I will feed the LED lead into that, and we want just enough to put into the actual expansion board. The length of the LED wire is only 15 centimeters. Once you've got it in place and you've got mobility, then you can glue down the LED. And remember that when you put that arm peg into the socket, you only want to heat the socket, not the arm, and it will require force to put it in there. So push and twist, turn to put it back in its place. It's the same for both arms. Let's check it out. Let's see if the light is working. It's working all right. It looks awesome. This is what your project should look like now. For reassembly, remember, only heat up the joint, not the actual pegs. And that main peg in the center and the torso is going to be incredibly difficult to put back in there. So take your time. If you don't add lights, you don't have to take it apart. Just go ahead straight into the painting. This is what it should look like. It looks incredible. I go USB. I don't like putting in batteries. You have to stockpile batteries that last only 30 hours and they can leak inside. So, as a recap, let's go in and take a look at what we used. 2 ice blue LEDs, 1 white LED, that was in the arm, 1 expansion board, that's where everything's hooked up, 1 power lead, also hooked up to the expansion board, and then UV resin to hold that LED in place. I'm going to leave you with some video now. I hope you like what you've learned today. If you do, please give it a like. It really helps out the channel. And of course, subscribe if you haven't done so. But most important, make sure you keep customizing your figures. Enjoy the rest of the clip. And at the very end, stay to the end because there's a small highlight and you've got to come back to the channel to watch the continuation of that highlight. Have a good one.